Get out of my sight. Her stepmother's voice cut across the kitchen like a blade, sharp, deliberate, meant to wound. Edith Mercer didn't even look up from her coffee when she said it, just waved one manicured hand toward the door like Rowan was a fly she'd grown tired of tolerating. Mr. Ashcroft's man sent word he's coming to inspect the property this afternoon. I need you gone before he arrives. Edith finally looked up, and her eyes traveled slowly, cruelly, from Rowan's worn boots to her faded gray work dress, the one with the fraying hem and the scorched sleeve from last winter's lantern accident. Dressed like that, you'll embarrass this family. You always do. Rowan stood perfectly still, 26 years old, calloused hands, sun-darkened skin. A woman who had pulled this ranch back from the edge of ruin 3 times in the last 5 years, with those same hands, in that same dress, and her stepmother was sending her away like she was the help. She picked up her hat off the hook by the door. She didn't argue. She never argued. What was the point? What Edith didn't know, what no one in Blackstone Ridge knew yet, was that the man coming to inspect their property that afternoon wasn't just a land agent. He wasn't a hired hand with a clipboard and a polished manner. Gideon Ashcroft was the owner, and he had already met Rowan Mercer once before. If you've ever been made to feel invisible inside your own home, if you've ever worked yourself to the bone while someone else took the credit, smiled at the guests, and pretended you didn't exist, then this story is for you. Stay with us until the very end, because what happens next in Blackstone Valley will remind you that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the one holding everything together. And the day the world finally sees them changes everything. If this story moves you, please subscribe and hit that like button. Your support is what keeps these stories coming. And drop a comment letting us know what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to where it all truly began. The morning Rowan Mercer turned 26, nobody remembered. Not her father, who was already on his second whiskey by the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge. Not her half-sisters, Cora and Della, who were consumed with the far more pressing business of whose hair looked better pinned up versus left loose. Not Edith, who had married into the Mercer name 11 years ago and proceeded to redecorate the house, redirect the household income, and systematically erase every trace of Rowan's mother from every room she had ever loved. Rowan remembered, of course. She always remembered everything. It was, depending on the day, either her greatest strength or her heaviest burden. She was up before 4 that morning, the same as every morning. The bunkhouse was still dark when she crossed the yard, her boots crunching softly on the dry, cracked earth that hadn't seen real rain in 7 weeks. 7 weeks of blazing sky and withering grass and cattle that were growing lean in ways that kept her awake at night. Doing math she didn't like the answers to. She fed the horses first. She always fed the horses first. There were 6 of them now, down from 11 the previous spring. Her father had sold 5 without telling her, which she'd discovered only when she went to the south paddock one Tuesday morning and found it empty. He'd needed money, he said later, shrugging. She didn't ask what he'd spent it on. She already knew. After the horses came the cattle check, then the fence inspection on the north pasture, then the water levels in the 2 remaining stock tanks. She carried a small leather notebook in her breast pocket, worn soft as skin by now, where she tracked everything. Water depth, grass height, which cattle were losing weight and at what rate, which patches of hillside were showing the early signs of drought stress that she'd learned to read the way other women read weather in their joints. The land was sick. She knew it, had known it for 2 seasons now. The question was whether anyone else would figure it out before it was too late. She was mending a stretch of fence line along the creek bed when her father found her that afternoon. Harlan Mercer moved the way all men do when they've been drinking before noon. Carefully, like the ground might tilt. He was 53 and looked 67, with the kind of deep, permanent squint that came from years of scanning a horizon for rain that didn't come. "There's a dance tonight," he said, without preamble. "Over at the Caldwell barn." Rowan didn't look up from the wire. "I know. Edith wants the girls to go, wants you to come along too." He paused. "Help set up." Help set up. Not, "come have a good time," or "take a night off." Help set up. Move furniture, carry things. Be useful in the background so the real Mercer women could shine. She twisted the fence wire tight and clipped it. "I'll be there." "Good." He turned to go, then seemed to remember something and turned back. The girls need the buggy. You'll have to ride. I always ride, she said. He left without responding to that. The Caldwell Barn Dance was the social event of the season, which in Blackstone Ridge didn't face much competition. The valley was small, 40-something miles long, maybe 15 wide, ringed by the dry Sutter Mountains on 3 sides and open grassland on the 4th. There were 11 working ranches, 2 small towns, a church, a blacksmith, a general store, a doctor who was also the dentist and occasionally the mortician, and about 300 people who knew each other's business with the intimacy that only comes from geographic captivity. Rowan arrived early to help with the tables. She set up lanterns and hauled benches and moved hay bales into seating arrangements, and by the time the guests began arriving, she had retreated to the outer edge of things, which was where she was most comfortable. She watched Cora and Della enter like they always entered, together, laughing at something, their hair catching lamplight. They were beautiful girls. Rowan had never resented them their beauty. Exactly. What she resented was the way beauty seemed to excuse everything else. The selfishness, the carelessness, the way they borrowed things without asking and apologized without meaning it. She resented that no one seemed to notice, or if they noticed, no one seemed to care. She was nursing a cup of cider she didn't particularly want when the music started, and that was when she heard it. Not the music. Something underneath the music. A sound she recognized before she consciously identified it. The specific, escalating panic of a large animal in a confined space. A horse. One of the Caldwell's horses, she realized, from the direction. The east side of the barn, near the old storage stalls. She was moving before the screaming started. The horse had gotten into the back storage area somehow, probably a poorly latched gate, and had managed to wedge itself between a fallen timber support and a stack of old feed barrels that had shifted. It was a big bay, maybe 16 hands, and it was absolutely terrified. Every time it tried to pull free, the timber shifted and the barrels rattled and the sound spooked it worse, and each new attempt was tightening the trap. 3 men were already there by the time Rowan pushed through the side door. 2 ranch hands and a man she didn't recognize, tall, standing a few feet back from the chaos with a lit lantern, watching the scene with focused, evaluating eyes. The ranch hands were arguing about whether to use a rope or try to move the barrels first, their voices rising over the horse's increasingly frantic movements. "You rope that animal right now. You'll spook it worse," Rowan said, pushing between them. One of them, Pete Garvin, who'd worked the Caldwell place for years, turned to look at her with the specific expression men reserve for women who enter conversations uninvited. "We know what we're doing." "You're going to get someone killed," she said, not unkindly. Just factually. "Give me space." "Rowan," but she was already moving toward the horse. She did not move fast. She moved slowly, which was the whole point. She kept her body low and loose and her arms down, and she breathed, deliberately, audibly, setting a rhythm the horse could hear and begin to track without meaning to. She talked, low and steady, not words exactly, more like the shape of words. A murmur that meant, "I am not a threat. I am not afraid. There is nothing to fear here." The horse's ears, which had been flat back with terror, swiveled, tracked her. She got within arm's reach and set one hand flat on its neck, felt the sweat and the trembling and the big rolling eye that was all white around the edges. She kept her hand still. She kept breathing. "Okay," she said quietly, to no one in particular. "Whoever's got that lantern, can you bring it around to the left side? I need it lower. Yeah, there." She didn't look at who held the lantern. She was entirely focused on the horse, on the angle of the timber, on the specific geometry of how the animal had managed to trap itself, and therefore how it needed to move to get free. "Easy," she murmured. "Easy, big boy. I know it's scary, but you're not stuck. You're really not stuck. You've just convinced yourself you are." She shifted her weight, moved around the horse's left shoulder, kept contact the entire time. One hand always touching, always communicating calm, calm, calm. She found the angle she needed. She got her shoulder under the edge of the timber, took the weight, and said, in the same quiet voice, "Back up now, slow, back." The horse backed up, the timber shifted, the barrels didn't fall. And in less than 90 seconds, the bay was standing free in the doorway, blowing hard but no longer panicking, its head hanging down as the adrenaline drained. There was a moment of complete silence. Then one of the ranch hands said, in a tone caught somewhere between relieved and embarrassed, "How'd you do that?" Rowan stepped back and became aware that a small crowd had gathered at the doorway behind her. Guess who'd noticed the commotion, lamplight spilling out from the barn. She was also aware, suddenly, of her dress. The worn gray one. The fraying hem. The way she must have looked, crouched under a fallen timber with horse sweat on her hands and probably hay in her hair. She heard Edith's voice from somewhere in the crowd, a brittle social laugh that Rowan recognized as the sound her stepmother made when she was embarrassed and needed to redirect attention. "Rowan does love to make herself the center of things," Edith said brightly, to no one in particular, to everyone who would listen. "She's always been theatrical." Theatrical. She had just stopped 400 pounds of panicked horse from killing itself or someone else, and the word Edith reached for was theatrical. Rowan stepped back further and would have disappeared into the shadows entirely, the way she usually did, except that she nearly walked into the man holding the lantern. He'd stayed. While the crowd gathered and Edith performed and the ranch hands began congratulating themselves on how well they'd handled the situation, he had stayed exactly where he'd been, lantern in hand, and she nearly put her elbow through his ribs. She caught herself and stepped back. "Sorry." "Don't be," he said. He was young, or younger than she'd expected from the quiet authority with which he'd stood back and simply watched. Late 20s, maybe 30, lean in the particular way of men who work outdoors but don't advertise it. Dark eyes that were doing exactly what eyes did when they were actually paying attention to you, not at you. "That was remarkable," he said. "It wasn't," she said, automatic deflection. She just got scared and convinced herself she was trapped. "That's almost always the problem," he said, "with horses and with people." She looked at him more carefully then. There was something about the way he said it, not like a man trying to sound wise, but like a man who had actually thought about it. "I haven't seen you before," she said. "I haven't been here before." He offered his free hand. "Gideon." She took it. Working hands. "Rowan Mercer." "Mercer," he said, as if filing it. "The ranch on the North Creek?" "That's the one." She studied him. "You know it?" "I know the valley," he said, which was not quite an answer. Before she could push further, Cora materialized at her elbow. Perfect timing, perfect smile, hand already extended toward the man with the lantern, with the practiced ease of a woman who had been inserting herself between Rowan and any possible interesting conversation since approximately 1887. "I don't believe we've met," Cora said warmly to Gideon. "I'm Cora Mercer. This is my sister Della." Della had appeared on the other side, completing the flanking movement. "We were so worried about that poor horse." Gideon looked at Cora, then at Della, smiled politely, the particular smile that meant, "I see exactly what's happening here. Pleased to meet you both." He glanced back at Rowan once, briefly, and then Cora was talking and Della was laughing and the moment was over. Rowan walked out of the barn and didn't look back. She didn't think about him again, or she tried not to. She was good at not thinking about things she couldn't afford to think about. It was a skill she'd cultivated like every other skill on this ranch, out of pure necessity. 3 days later, she was on the South Ridge checking the condition of the upper grazing grass when she spotted a rider below on the creek road. She wouldn't have paid much attention except for 2 things. First, the horse was a very good horse, the kind of horse that cost more than most ranchers in this valley earned in a year. And second, the rider stopped at the entrance to her family's property, dismounted and stood there reading something, a paper, a document of some kind, with the specific stillness of a man who had read it before and was reading it again to confirm what he already knew. She came down off the ridge slowly, keeping her distance, watching. He looked up when she was still 50 yards out, watched her come the rest of the way with those same attentive eyes she'd noticed in the barn. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Mr. She stopped. "Gideon, you said—" "Gideon Ashcroft." He folded the paper and put it in his coat. "I was going to come up to the house." "Why?" He considered the question with a directness she wasn't prepared for. Most people dressed things up when they had bad news to deliver. They eased in from the sides, approached at angles, spoke in euphemisms. He didn't appear to be that kind of person. "Because I own this property now," he said, "and I'd like to understand what I've purchased." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. She felt it press against her sternum. "My father sold the lease," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd known it was coming. She'd seen the numbers. She'd done the math. "Your father sold the lease," he confirmed. She looked at him, really looked at him, taking inventory the way she took inventory of the land, cataloging everything. The quality of his gear, the patience in his posture, the fact that he hadn't yet looked at the house, hadn't asked about the house, was standing here at the entrance and looking at her. "Who are you?" she asked. Not meaning his name, meaning something larger. He looked out at the valley, the brown, drought-stressed hills, the silver thread of the dying creek, the way the mountains behind held their shapes even as everything below them struggled. "I've been buying the leases," he said quietly, "in this valley, for the past 8 months. She did the math fast, the way she always did. 11 ranches, 8 months, quietly, without anyone knowing. "All of them?" she said. He looked back at her. "Most of them." The world was reshaping itself around her in real time. The man she'd met in a barn 3 nights ago with a lantern in his hand, the man who had watched her work with the kind of attention she'd almost forgotten people could pay. He didn't just own her family's failing lease, he owned the entire valley, and he was standing at her gate, looking at her like she was the one thing in Blackstone Ridge he actually wanted to understand. She thought about the worn gray dress, the way Edith had laughed, theatrical. She thought about the water tables she'd been tracking for 2 years, the grass surveys, the fire risk assessments she'd written in her little leather notebook that no one had ever asked to see. She pushed open the gate. "Come up to the barn," she said. "I'll show you what you actually bought." He followed her to the barn without a word. That was the first thing she noticed, that he didn't fill the silence with small talk, didn't try to establish authority or soften the situation with pleasantries. He just walked beside her through the dry yard, past the water trough, with its worrying low line, past the empty south paddock that still felt like a missing tooth every time she crossed it, and he looked at things the way she looked at things. Carefully. Without needing to announce that he was doing it. She pulled open the barn door and went to the workbench along the east wall, where she kept a rolled survey map she'd drawn herself over the course of 2 winters, working from memory and from hours spent walking the ridge lines with a compass and a level. She spread it on the bench and weighted the corners with whatever was nearby. A hammer, a tin of linseed oil, a cracked bridle fitting she kept meaning to repair. "This is what you bought," she said. He stepped up beside her and looked at the map. She watched his face, the way his eyes moved, not scanning, actually reading, following the topographical markings she'd made, the notations in the margins in her small, cramped handwriting. "You made this," he said. "Nobody else was going to." He leaned in closer to read a notation near the upper creek line. "Water table dropping approximately 8 inches per season, projected dry by 3rd summer if precipitation does not recover." He straightened. "When did you write that?" 2 years ago." He was quiet for a moment. "And has it dropped 8 inches?" 9, she said. I was optimistic. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not pity, not condescension. Something closer to the look a man gets when he realizes he's been handed information he should have had much earlier and is working out what it costs him that he didn't. "Does your father know this?" She almost laughed. It came out as something shorter and sharper. "My father knows the price of cattle at the Harmon auction and the hours the saloon closes. The land," she paused, chose her words with the care she usually reserved for situations where the wrong word could spook an animal. "My father trusts the land to take care of itself. And when it can't? That's what I'm for," she said, flatly. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the map. She watched him process it. The creek system, the pasture rotations she'd mapped out, the notations about which hillsides were losing their grass cover and in what pattern, the small red marks she'd made at 3 locations in the Upper Sutter foothills that represented something she'd been watching with growing dread for 2 months now. He pointed at one of the red marks. "What's this?" She'd been waiting for that question. She wasn't sure yet whether she was relieved or nervous that he'd found it on his own. "That's why I said come see the barn," she said, "not the house." She took him out the following morning, not because he'd asked, exactly. He'd said he wanted to see the upper pastures, and she'd said she knew them better than anyone, and they'd arrived at the same conclusion without either of them having to make it into something it wasn't yet. She gave him the better of the two horses she had left, a solidly built roan named Fletcher, who was reliable on mountain terrain. She took her own mare, a leggy bay named Compass, who was not particularly pretty but had the best feet she'd ever seen on a horse and an uncanny ability to sense unstable ground before any human could. They rode north out of the valley in the early gray of the morning before the heat settled in and made the upper trails miserable. The first hour was mostly silence, which she appreciated. She'd expected him to ask questions, the kind of questions landowners usually asked, about property boundaries and lease terms and which improvements were structural versus personal, but he didn't. He rode and he watched, and occasionally he'd pull up and look at something for a long moment before moving on. They were halfway up the ridge when he said, "How long have you been running this ranch?" She thought about the honest answer. "Officially, I haven't been. Not officially. Unofficially. Since I was about 17. She kept her eyes on the trail. "My mother died when I was 9. My father managed for a few years. Then Edith came, and my father found other things to do with his time, and someone had to keep the livestock alive. And that someone was you. There wasn't anyone else who wanted the job." She heard him make it a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite sympathy, more like a man absorbing information and choosing not to offer a response that would be inadequate to the weight of it. She appreciated that too. They crested the ridge just as the sun came fully over the eastern mountains, and she pulled Compass up and waited while he brought Fletcher alongside. Below them, the valley spread out in the morning light, and it looked at this distance like it might be fine, like the brown was just the normal late summer color, and the thin thread of the creek was just the season, and the gaps in the cattle herds were nothing to worry about. Distance was kind to struggling places. "It's beautiful," he said. "It's dying," she said. "Don't let the view fool you. Beautiful places die the same as ugly ones. They just look better doing it." He turned to look at her. She kept her eyes on the valley. "Show me the red marks," he said. The first sight was an hour's ride into the Sutter foothills, up a switchback trail that Compass navigated with her usual uncanny confidence while Fletcher picked his way more cautiously behind her. When they arrived, Rowan dismounted and walked to the edge of a rocky outcrop and pointed. The hillside below them was wrong, not in a way that would have been obvious to most people. It required knowing what the hillside was supposed to look like, what it had looked like 3 years ago, 5 years ago, before the drought took hold and began doing its slow, quiet work. But she had walked this hillside. She knew the grass varieties that grew here, or had grown here, and she knew what was replacing them. And what was replacing them was the kind of dry, fine-stemmed scrub growth that cured in the summer heat and became, by late autumn, something functionally indistinguishable from tinder. "What am I looking at?" Gideon asked beside her. "See the color change about 2/3 of the way up? Where it goes from brown to almost silver gray?" "Yes. That's cheatgrass. It moved in when the native grass died back. It dries early and it burns fast. 3 years ago, none of that was here. Now it's on this face, the east face, and the north cut above the Henderson lease." She paused. "The prevailing wind in this valley runs south-southwest in late summer and fall. If something ignites on this hillside..." She let the math do the rest of the sentence. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she glanced sideways to check his face and found him looking not at the hillside but at her. "You've been watching this for how long?" 2 years. "And you've told my father," she said. "Twice. He said dry summers are part of ranching and I worry too much." A muscle moved in his jaw. "Who else?" "Ed Caldwell. He's the closest neighbor to the north face." She paused. "He thanked me for my concern and offered to lend me a recipe book because apparently that was what I should be focusing on." Gideon looked at her for another moment, and then he looked back at the hillside, and she could see him doing what she'd been doing for 2 years, running the calculations, tracing the wind lines in his head, mapping it against everything he'd seen on her hand-drawn map that morning. "How bad?" he said. "If we get a dry lightning storm in August or September, and we've had 3 of those in the last 4 years, and the wind is right?" She picked up a dry piece of scrub from the ground near her boot and held it for a moment. It crumbled between her fingers without resistance. "I don't know how much of this valley would still be standing." She let the crumbled grass fall from her hand, and the breeze took it, and neither of them spoke for a while. They ate lunch at the second site, which was less dramatic but in some ways more disturbing, A spring she'd found at 16, tucked into a rocky fold in the hillside where water had seeped year-round for as long as anyone in the valley could remember. Or rather, it had been a spring. Now it was a muddy shadow of itself, a dark stain on the rock where water had been, with only the thinnest thread still emerging from the crack, barely enough to fill a cupped hand. She'd brought biscuits and salt beef, wrapped in cloth in her saddlebag, and they sat on opposite sides of the diminished spring and ate. And she watched him watch the water and understood that he was beginning to truly see the valley, not the valley as he'd purchased it on paper, but the valley as it actually existed, as she'd known it her entire life, with all its precariousness and stubborn beauty, and the growing list of things that were going wrong under the surface. "You said the water table has dropped 9 inches in 2 years," he said. "In the north pasture. On the south side it's worse." She chewed, swallowed. "The creek that runs through the Henderson property, the one that looks like it still has flow, it's running on surface water only. The underground feed is gone. One more dry season, and that creek is a ditch." He looked at her. "Does Henderson know?" "Henderson sold his lease to you 6 weeks ago," she said. "So I suppose it's your problem now." Something crossed his face. Not offense, something more like recognition. She hadn't meant it as an accusation exactly, though she understood it had landed like one. She considered walking it back and decided not to. It was true. These problems were his now, every last one of them, and the sooner he understood the full weight of what he'd purchased, the better the chance that someone in this valley might actually do something about it before it was too late. "You're not going to make this easier on me, are you?" he said. "Should I?" He considered. "No," he said. "Probably not." She handed him the last biscuit because he'd taken smaller portions than her, and she'd been working since 4 in the morning and could afford the generosity. He accepted it without comment, which she also appreciated. "Why did you buy the valley?" she asked. "All of it. Why?" He was quiet for a moment, turning the biscuit in his hands. "The Ashcroft family has holdings across 3 territories. Timber, primarily. Some mining. My father built the business on the assumption that you take what the land offers, as much as it offers, as fast as it offers it, and then you move on to the next piece of land." He paused. "I watched that approach for a long time. I don't think it's right. I think it's short-term thinking dressed up as ambition." She waited. "Blackstone Valley has good bones," he said. "The water system, what's left of it, could be rebuilt if it was managed properly. The grazing land could recover with rotation. The fire risk," he glanced at her, "is manageable if someone actually manages it instead of pretending it isn't there." He finally ate the biscuit. "I want to do it differently here. I came here to do it differently." She thought about that for a long time, looking at the near-dead spring, at the dark stain on the rock where water used to be generous. "You bought 9 ranches in 8 months without talking to any of us," she said. "That's not exactly a partnership approach." He didn't look away. "No, it isn't. That's a fair criticism." "I'm not interested in being fair. I'm interested in whether you're serious." "I'm serious," he said simply, without dressing it up. She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze without flinching and without performing, and she found, despite herself, that she believed him. "There's a third sight," she said, standing up and brushing off her trousers. "The worst one. You should see it before you decide anything." They rode back down the mountain in the late afternoon with the sun behind them, throwing their shadows long and thin ahead on the trail. They were closer to each other than they'd been riding up. The trail was narrower on this section, and Compass and Fletcher had settled into the easy companionship of horses who've spent a day working alongside each other. Rowan was aware of the proximity in a way she didn't entirely know what to do with, so she focused on the trail and kept talking instead, because talking about the land was the one thing she always knew how to do. "The grass rotation schedule my father used is 15 years out of date," she said. "It was designed for a wetter climate and heavier stock numbers. We're running fewer animals, but the grass isn't recovering the way it should because we're grazing the same sections in the same order, and the sections that need the longest rest are getting the shortest. What would you change?" "I'd retire the 3 south sections completely for 2 growing seasons. Move the cattle exclusively to the north and middle rotations. It'll feel counterintuitive because you're reducing available pasture in the short term, but the recovery you'd get on those south sections by season 3 would more than compensate." "And the water?" There are two springs in the upper north quarter that nobody uses because they're a hard ride from the main operation. Neither is high volume, but both are consistent. If you ran a gravity line from the upper spring down to the north tanks. She sketched it in the air with one hand, the route she'd mapped in her head 100 times. You'd cut your dependence on the creek by probably 40%. That's manageable even in a dry year. He listened without interrupting, and she was aware, with a slight unsettling feeling, that she was handing him years of her own thinking. Plans she'd drawn up in the quiet of the barn late at night. Solutions she'd calculated with no one to talk to and nowhere to apply them, because no one had ever asked. Because no one had ever asked. She went quiet for a while, a little startled by her own generosity. He seemed to sense the shift. "You've been working on this for years," he said. Not a question. There wasn't much else to do. "Does it bother you," he said, "that no one asked?" She looked out at the valley, now dropping back into view below them as they rounded the last switchback. The evening was coming on in shades of amber and old copper, the kind of sky this country was genuinely magnificent at producing, as if it was compensating for the harshness of every other hour of the day. "I used to think about more," she said. "Now I mostly think about the work." It was mostly true. They were back in the yard by dusk, and Rowan was unsaddling Compass when she heard the kitchen door open and Edith's footsteps on the porch. That particular sharp clicking walk, the sound of a woman who'd decided something and was moving to execute it. "Mr. Ashcroft." Edith's voice was warm in a very specific way. The warmth of someone who has just realized a guest is more important than previously understood and is recalibrating in real time. "We didn't know you'd be spending the day. I would have had something proper prepared." "That's very kind, Mrs. Mercer," Gideon said, from where he stood, still holding Fletcher's reins. "I hope I haven't caused any inconvenience." "Not at all." A brief pause, during which Rowan imagined Edith taking in the situation. Her stepdaughter and the landowner, back from a day in the mountains together. The easy, pragmatic way they'd come back side by side without any of the careful social distances Edith would have imposed. "I see Rowan has been playing guide." "She's been indispensable," Gideon said, and the flatness of his delivery, no hesitation, no qualification, made Edith pause. Rowan kept her hands on the saddle buckle and didn't look up. "Well," Edith said, and there was something slightly off in the word, a small recalibration. "Dinner will be ready within the hour, if you'd like to come inside. Cora and Della would love the company." "I'm afraid I need to get back," he said. "I have papers to review before tomorrow, but I'd like to return in a few days if that suits. There's more of the property I want to understand." Another pause. "Of course," Edith said. "We'd be delighted." After she went back inside, Rowan finished with the saddle and turned Fletcher loose in the paddock. When she turned around, Gideon was standing a few feet away, close enough that the lack of distance registered without being close enough to mean anything. He was looking at her with that particular attentiveness she still hadn't gotten entirely used to. "Thursday," he said. "What?" "I'll be back Thursday, if you're available." She looked at him for a moment, long enough to understand that he wasn't asking about the land survey, or not only about the land survey. There was something else in the question, small and precise and not yet fully declared, the way the first indicator of fire on a hillside is not flame, but heat shimmer, something you feel before you see. "I'm always up before 4, she said. He nodded once. "I'll be here at 4:30. He left, and the yard was quiet, and Compass nickered softly from the paddock, and Rowan stood in the gathering dark for a long moment with her arms crossed and her weight shifted to one hip, looking at nothing in particular. She heard the kitchen window slide open above her, heard Edith's voice, lowered but distinct, directed presumably at Cora. "I don't understand what he sees in her. She spent the entire day showing him ditches." And Cora's voice, lightly dismissive, with the particular tone she used when a thing inconvenienced her. "It won't last. Men like that don't end up with women like Rowan." Rowan walked to the barn and closed the door behind her without slamming it. She sat down on the bench inside, in the familiar smell of hay and horse and old leather, and looked at her own hands in the last gray light coming through the high window. Calloused palms. A scar on the left thumb from a wire accident 4 years ago. Dirt that never quite washed out of the knuckle lines, no matter how hard she scrubbed. She thought about what Gideon had said about doing things differently, about the valley having good bones, about wanting to manage it instead of just extracting from it. She thought about the way he'd listened. Men like that don't end up with women like Rowan. Maybe not. Probably not. She was not a woman who built her life on probably nots, and she had more pressing things to think about. 9 inches of dropped water table, a hillside full of fire-ready cheatgrass, a spring that was nearly dead, and a ranch that was held together by her expertise and her father's increasingly meaningless signature on documents she'd drafted herself. But she sat in the barn for a while longer than she needed to before going inside to eat dinner alone in the kitchen while Edith and her daughters entertained themselves in the parlor. And she thought about Thursday, and the 4:30 dark, and a man who had looked at her worn gray dress and her battered survey map and said, without performance, "You've been indispensable." She thought about how long it had been since anyone had said anything like that to her. She thought about how dangerous it was to need it. Outside, the wind had picked up from the south-southwest, the exact direction she'd noted in her notebook twice already this summer, the direction that mattered, the direction the fire would come from when it finally came. She opened her notebook and wrote the date and the wind speed and the direction and the temperature, the same as she did every evening, the same record nobody had ever asked to see. She closed it and went to sleep. Thursday arrived the way all significant days arrive, indistinguishable from any other until it isn't. She was in the yard with her coffee when his horse came down the road in the 4:30 dark, exactly when he'd said, and something settled in her chest at that. Not relief, exactly. More like the recognition of a man who meant what he said, which had become rare enough in her world to be notable. They rode the South Pastures that day. Then the following week, the East Ridge. Then the creek system from source to the valley floor, a 2-day circuit she'd made alone every spring to track the water conditions. Except this time, she wasn't alone. The valley noticed. Of course it noticed. Blackstone Ridge was a place where a stranger's horse tied outside the general store for 20 minutes generated discussion. A young landowner, and an Ashcroft at that, a name that had been carrying weight in this territory for 2 generations, riding out with Rowan Mercer's overlooked daughter 3, 4, 5 times in as many weeks. That was not a small thing. That was the kind of thing that got talked about between the feed store and the Sunday social and every point in between. She heard it in fragments. A comment from Pete Garvin that reached her sideways through one of the ranch hands. A look from Martha Eldridge at the general store that lasted half a second longer than it needed to. Cora, at dinner one night, not quite meeting her eyes while saying, very casually, that she'd heard people were gossiping about Rowan riding around with Mr. Ashcroft, and wasn't it funny how people talked? "It's funny," Rowan said, and passed the bread, and didn't elaborate. What she didn't say, what she couldn't say, not even in the privacy of her own notebook, was that the rides had become the thing she thought about during every other part of her day. Not in a way she entirely trusted. She was too careful for that, too well acquainted with the cost of wanting things she had no business wanting. But she thought about them. She thought about the morning on the East Ridge when they'd pulled up to watch a hawk work the thermals below them, and the silence had been so easy and so complete that she'd realized, with a startled internal lurch, that she couldn't remember the last time she'd been this comfortable in another person's company. And then she'd immediately begun mentally listing everything that was wrong with that feeling, beginning with the fact that he owned every lease in this valley and her family was behind on theirs by 3 months. She thought about the afternoon he'd asked her, out of nowhere, what she would do with the North Spring system if the money were available. Not what she'd recommend, what she would do. And she'd answered, in the kind of practical, specific detail she usually rationed carefully around people who she expected to stop listening, and he hadn't stopped listening. He'd asked follow-up questions for 2 hours. She thought about that more than was reasonable. The problem was that she knew how this kind of story usually went. She had watched her father fall for a beautiful woman who'd turned out to be primarily interested in the property. She had watched Cora cycle through 3 serious prospects in 2 years, each one discarded when a slightly better option appeared. She understood how attraction worked in a place like this, where resources were scarce and social position mattered in very tangible ways, and she understood exactly where she stood in that calculation. The plain-faced, calloused-handed woman in the worn work dress who knew things, and how that was almost never enough. Almost. She was carrying water to the North Trough one evening when Edith came out of the house with an expression that had been building for days. The look of a woman who had decided a conversation was overdue. "People are talking," Edith said. "You mentioned." I'm telling you for your own good, Rowan. Men like Gideon Ashcroft don't. She stopped, rearranged. He's being kind to you. He wants your knowledge about the land. When he has what he needs, he'll find an appropriate match, and that will be the end of it. I don't want to see you make a fool of yourself. Rowan set down the water bucket, turned to face her stepmother. Edith was not a cruel woman at her core, Rowan had decided long ago. She was a frightened woman, frightened of poverty, of irrelevance, of a world that did not value her the way she believed it should. That fear came out as cruelty sometimes, and sometimes as this, a kind of protective warning that was also, underneath, a reminder of her place. Thank you for your concern, Rowan said. Rowan, I've got a water line to finish before dark. She picked up the bucket. Excuse me. She walked away before Edith could say anything else, and she didn't let herself think about the words, he'll find an appropriate match, until much later, alone in the barn with her notebook, where she wrote them down and then drew a line through them. She drew the line hard enough that the pen went through the paper. She looked at that for a moment. Then she turned the page and wrote the water table numbers for the week, and the grass conditions, and the wind direction, and the temperature at dusk. The wind was south-southwest again, stronger than last week. She looked at her fire risk notes for the third site, the worst one, the one she hadn't yet taken Gideon to see, the hollow in the upper Sutter Range where the dry fuel had been accumulating for 2 seasons in a funnel formation that she'd been dreaming about, badly, for weeks. Thursday, she decided. She'd take him to the third site on Thursday. Whatever else she felt or didn't feel or shouldn't feel, the fire was real, and the fuel was building, and the wind was wrong, and somebody with the actual power to do something about it needed to understand what she'd been watching alone for 2 years. She closed the notebook. She put out the lantern. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind and thought about good bones and water that could be rebuilt, and a man who had looked at her map and read every notation. Sleep came eventually, the way it always did. Not easily, but honestly, the way everything in her life came. He arrived on Thursday as promised, but he wasn't alone. Rowan saw the second horse before she saw the second rider. A flashier animal than Fletcher, black with white stockings, the kind of horse chosen for impression rather than function. She was standing in the yard with her coffee mug when they came down the road together, and something in her settled into a different kind of readiness, the kind she used when she didn't yet know what she was dealing with. The man beside Gideon was his age or close to it, but carried himself differently, the way men do when they've spent more time in offices than outdoors, when they've learned that authority is performed rather than earned. He was dressed well, too well for a morning ride into the mountains. His boots were clean. Rowan. Gideon pulled up in the yard. He said her name the way he'd been saying it for the past several weeks, without the miss, without the formality, which had stopped being notable somewhere around the second week and had become, quietly, the thing she'd started listening for. This is my cousin, Dorian Ashcroft. He arrived from the Eastern office yesterday. Dorian Ashcroft looked at her the way people look at furniture they're trying to determine the value of. A quick, efficient appraisal, top to bottom, that ended with the particular micro-expression of a man who has decided something doesn't quite meet the standard without being able to specify exactly why. Miss Mercer, he said, politely, correctly, with exactly enough warmth to be socially functional and not 1 degree more. Mr. Ashcroft, she said. Dorian came to review the acquisition, Gideon said, and there was something careful in how he said it. Not quite an apology, not quite a warning. Something in between. The portfolio, Dorian said, producing from his coat a folded sheaf of papers that she recognized immediately as the kind of documents produced by men who understand land only as numbers on a ledger. 11 properties acquired over 8 months. It's a significant capital deployment, and the board requires an in-person assessment before we proceed to the development phase. He looked around the yard with the focused efficiency of a man taking mental inventory. I'll need to review the lease status for each property, beginning with this one. He said this one the way you say this one about a problem you've already categorized. Gideon was watching her face. She kept it neutral, which cost her less effort than it would have a few years ago. I was going to take Gideon up to the third site today, she said. You're welcome to ride along. Dorian glanced at his clean boots. I'll review the paperwork first, if you don't mind. Perhaps Mrs. Mercer can show me to somewhere suitable to work. She minded. She kept that to herself. I'll let my stepmother know you're here. She went inside and told Edith, who reacted to Dorian Ashcroft, the cousin, from the Eastern office, the way a compass reacts to north. Immediate, total reorientation. By the time Rowan came back out, Edith was already at the door in her better day dress, and the quality of attention she directed at Dorian was a different species entirely from what she'd ever spared for Rowan. Gideon had dismounted. He fell into step beside Rowan as she headed toward the barn to saddle Compass. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't know he was planning to come today." "Why is he here?" she said. Same quiet register. A pause that told her more than the answer that followed. "The Mercer lease is 3 months behind." She'd known that. Of course she'd known that. She was the one who understood the ranch's financial situation better than anyone, including her father, who had a gift for avoiding any information that required him to do something uncomfortable. "How far behind can it go?" she said. "Dorian's threshold is 60 days, Gideon said. "We're past that." She stopped walking, turned to look at him directly, because this was the kind of conversation that required looking at a person directly. "What does that mean?" He met her eyes. "It means he has the authority to terminate the lease and begin the removal process. Legally." The yard was quiet except for the early birds and the distant sound of Edith inside the house, already being charming at Dorian Ashcroft. "And what do you have the authority to do?" Rowan said. Something moved across his face, not discomfort exactly. The look of a man who has power and dislikes the fact that he has to use it to block another person with power from doing something wrong. "I outrank him," Gideon said. "But he also brought 3 board members' written positions in that folder, and the written positions say the same thing he does." She looked at him for another moment. Then she turned and kept walking toward the barn. "Then we'd better get to the third site," she said, "because what's up there changes the math on everything, and your cousin needs to understand that before he starts making decisions with his folder." So, she'd been right that the third site was the worst. She'd been right about everything, which was the specific variety of being right that gave her no satisfaction whatsoever. The hollow in the upper Sutter Range was a natural funnel, 2 ridgelines converging at an angle that channeled the south-southwest wind directly down a long draw, and at the bottom of that draw, over 2 dry seasons, had accumulated the kind of dead fuel load that she'd only seen in pictures of places after they'd already burned. Gideon stood at the rim of it and was very still in the way she'd come to recognize as his particular response to information that genuinely alarmed him. Not dramatic, not performative, just very, very still. "If it starts here," she said, "and the wind is what it's been the last 3 weeks, it would reach the valley floor in under 2 hours, probably less. The Henderson place first, then the Caldwell North pasture, then—" She stopped because the rest of the list was long and the items on it had names. "How did this accumulate without anyone—" "Nobody comes up here," she said. "There's no grazing because there's no water. No reason to ride this far. Nobody looked." "You looked." "I look at everything." He turned to face her, and for a moment the wind picked up from the southwest, exactly as she'd known it would, and she watched it move through the dead fuel below them in a way that made her stomach tighten. "We need to clear this draw," he said. "I can get men up here within—" "It'll take 3 weeks to clear enough to matter, even with every hand you've got," she said. "And I don't think we have 3 weeks." She crouched down and picked up a dried stem from the ground near her boot, turned it in her fingers. It had no flecks left in it, no moisture. "We're in the window right now. Any dry lightning storm, any spark carried on that wind, what's your recommendation?" She looked up at him. He was asking her directly, the way he always asked her directly, without the hesitation that most men inserted between themselves and a woman's expertise, the half-second delay that meant, "Let me decide whether to actually take this seriously." He didn't do that. He never had. It was, she'd decided, the most disorienting thing about him. "A controlled burn," she said. "Lower section of the draw, on a calm morning before the afternoon winds pick up. Burn out the worst of the fuel load. If we're careful about when and where we set it, we eliminate the primary risk without losing anything we can't afford to lose." He was quiet. "It's a significant risk," she acknowledged. "A controlled burn in dry conditions requires exact timing and enough hands to manage the perimeter. If the wind shifts, what's the risk of not doing it?" She stood up. "Higher." They rode back down in silence, mostly, except for one exchange about a quarter mile from the valley floor. Dorian won't like it, Gideon said. I know. He'll say it's reckless. Liability exposure, insurance complications. All of which will matter a great deal less than the alternative, she said. I understand he has a folder. He made the short sound she'd come to recognize as the closest he came to a genuine laugh when something wasn't actually funny. He has a very organized folder. Numbers in a folder don't tell you what a hillside smells like in August, she said. They don't tell you what happens to a valley when it burns. No, he said. They don't. Dorian Ashcroft was, she gave him this, exceptionally efficient with paperwork. By the time they returned to the ranch that afternoon, he had laid out his documents on the kitchen table with a precision that suggested he'd done this many times before, organized by property, by financial status, by what he'd labeled in the top right corner of each stack as action required or review pending. The Mercer property file sat at the left of the table, in the action required stack, which she noted before she'd even crossed the threshold. Edith had made coffee and set out a plate of things she kept for guests, and Cora and Della were both present in the kitchen with reasons to be there that hadn't been present that morning, and the whole scene had the quality of a stage set where everyone was trying not to look like they were trying. Dorian looked up when they came in. His eyes went to Gideon first, then to Rowan, and she could see him reading the situation, the easy way they'd come in together, the mud on their boots from the same terrain, the kind of shared experience proximity that has nothing to do with propriety and everything to do with having spent hours in real conditions doing real work. She could see him not like it. I've reviewed the 11 files, Dorian said, addressing Gideon but not making much effort to exclude the room. 7 are performing adequately given the development timeline. 2 are marginal but recoverable with management changes. He set his hand flat on the Mercer stack. 2 require immediate action. Which 2? Gideon said. The Henderson lease, though as you noted, that one's already been surrendered, and the Mercer property. He looked at the table rather than at Rowan. 3 months behind on lease payments. Cattle numbers significantly below the contracted maintenance level. Infrastructure in poor repair. By the terms of the original agreement, we are well within our rights to— I'd like to show you something before you finish that sentence, Rowan said. The room went quiet. Edith had a very specific expression, the face of a woman who wanted to intervene but couldn't find the angle. Dorian looked at Rowan with the patience of a man who has learned to be patient with people who don't understand that his decisions are already made. Miss Mercer, he said. I have a survey map, she said. She didn't move toward the table yet. She stood in the doorway in her muddy boots and her worn gray work dress, and she looked at him directly. I've been tracking the condition of this valley for 2 years. The water table, the grass cover, the fuel load in the upper Sutter Range. I'd like you to see it before you decide anything, because what's happening in this valley right now is going to affect every property in that folder, not just this one. A pause. Dorian looked at Gideon. She's the reason I've understood this valley at all, Gideon said simply. Something shifted in Dorian's expression. Not much, but enough. The recalibration of a man who is efficient and not, beneath the efficiency, stupid. Show me, he said. She laid the map on the table beside his organized folders. She talked for 40 minutes. She didn't perform it, or soften it, or make it easier to hear. She walked him through the water table data, the grass surveys, the fuel accumulation timeline, the 3 sites she'd identified, the projected fire behavior based on current fuel loads and average wind conditions. She pointed out the Henderson Creek system and what its failure meant for the properties downstream. She showed him the notation she'd made 2 years ago about the water table and put beside them the actual measurements from last week. She'd predicted 9 inches. It was 11 now. He leaned over the map and was quiet for a long time. Cora, from the corner where she'd positioned herself near the coffee, said lightly, Rowan's always been very thorough about the land. She's been right about the land, Gideon said, and the way he said it closed the subject. Dorian straightened. He had the look of a man who has organized his understanding of a situation around one set of facts and is now being required to reorganize around a different set, which is never a comfortable process regardless of intelligence. The fuel load risk, he said to Rowan. You're recommending a controlled burn. I am. The liability exposure, if that fire gets out of control, is significant, she said. Less significant than the liability exposure if the valley burns uncontrolled and we had prior knowledge of the risk and did nothing. She held his gaze. Which we do. Which is documented, right here. He looked at the map again. At the red marks. At her 2-year-old notations sitting beside her current measurements. When would you do it? He said. She hadn't expected that question. Not yet. She'd expected more resistance, more folder consulting, more concern about insurance and board positions. The directness of it surprised her into a moment of recalibration of her own. We'd need a calm morning, she said. Wind below 10 miles an hour. Enough hands to manage the perimeter. I'd want at least 12, better 15. We pre-wet the eastern edge because that's where the risk of spread is highest. We start at first light and we're done before the afternoon winds build. She paused. I'd want to do it in the next 10 days. After that, the conditions are going to get worse, not better. Dorian looked at Gideon. She's never been wrong about this valley, Gideon said. Another pause. Then Dorian picked up the Mercer property file from the action required stack and moved it to review pending. It wasn't a decision, but it was a delay. And a delay, right now, was what she needed. That night was the worst one. Not because of Dorian's folder or the lease status or any of the things that should have been keeping her awake. Those things she could think about practically, could turn into lists and calculations and plans. What kept her awake was something harder to organize. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind, which had not dropped below 12 miles an hour all evening and was sitting around 15 as of the last time she'd checked, and she ran the numbers she always ran, the fuel load, the moisture content, the angle of the draw, and underneath the numbers was a fear she didn't have a measurement for. She was afraid she was right. Not about the fire risk. She knew she was right about the fire risk. She was afraid she was right about the things she'd been not thinking about since the first week she'd ridden with Gideon. The thing Edith had said, he'll find an appropriate match. The thing Cora had said, men like that don't end up with women like Rowan. And the more dangerous version of those things, the one that lived inside herself. That she was beginning to want something she had no business wanting. That it would cost her, one way or another. She heard a sound in the yard and went to the window. Gideon was still there, his horse tied at the post, which she hadn't realized, because Edith had invited him to supper, and supper had stretched into the evening with Dorian's map discussions, and by the time it ended, she'd slipped away to her room without specifically meaning to avoid him. He was standing in the yard looking at the sky, which was clear and full of stars, the kind of sky you only get in dry country. She watched him for a moment, then she went back to her cot and looked at the ceiling. She heard his horse leave about 10 minutes later. Then the yard was quiet. She picked up her notebook and opened it to a fresh page and started writing out the controlled burn logistics. The number of men, the pre-wedding positions, the perimeter management assignments, the timing, the contingency plan if the wind shifted. She wrote until the plan was as complete as she could make it alone, and then she closed the notebook and put it on the floor beside her cot. In the morning, she decided, she would present it to Gideon as a plan and not as a feeling. She was better at plans than feelings, plans she could defend, plans she could execute. She was 3/4 asleep when she heard Edith's voice through the thin wall that separated her room from the parlor. The house was small and the walls were what they were. He spent the whole day with her again. Edith's voice, low but carrying, addressing Harlan, presumably. Her father's responses were inaudible. I'm not saying anything improper is happening. I'm saying she's going to get attached. She always does this. She finds something to be useful for, and then she confuses utility with a pause. With something else. Rowan stared at the ceiling. The thing is, Harlan, she could have been something if she'd... Edith stopped, started again. She has no idea what she looks like to other people. Out there every day in that dress, hair any which way, hands like a... She could have at least tried. Rowan closed her eyes. She could have at least tried. Tried to be different than she was. Tried to be less useful and more decorative. Tried to be the kind of woman a man like Gideon Ashcroft would find appropriate. She was aware, with a clarity that was almost peaceful in its completeness, that she could not try to be that. That she did not know how to try to be that. That the part of herself which understood land and water and fire and the specific weight of a panicked horse's trust was not separable from the rest of her, not something she could put away when more polished company arrived. This was what she was. The worn dress. The calloused hands. The notebook filled with numbers nobody had asked for. And a fire coming down a mountain that only she had been watching long enough to understand. She heard Harlan Mercer's voice, finally audible, saying something about how it was fine. Everything would be fine. It always worked out. She turned over and faced the wall and thought about the fuel load in the upper draw, and the angle of the wind, and the 15 men she'd need on the perimeter line, and she stayed with those thoughts until they were heavy enough to sleep under. She was at the barn at 4 the next morning, same as always. She was measuring the water level in the north tank when she heard a horse on the road, and then Gideon's voice from the gate. "You left last night without saying anything," he said. She looked up. It was mounted, which meant he'd ridden out early specifically to be here, and she didn't know exactly what to do with that information, so she noted it and kept measuring. "I had work," she said. "You always have work." "That's true." He dismounted and tied the horse and came to stand near the tank, watching her work, which she'd noticed he did. He didn't stand back and wait for her to finish and address him. He came to where she was. "Dorian is going to push the lease termination," he said. "He's going to put it to me formally, within the week." She set down the measuring rod. "I know." "I'm going to tell him no." She looked at him. "You sure?" "I'm sure." "It'll cost you with the board." "Yes." "Your cousin's going to be angry." "He's often angry," Gideon said. "He manages." She looked at him for a long moment in the early morning dark. The stars were still out. The wind was quiet at this hour. It always was, which was why the morning window was what it was. "The controlled burn," she said. "I wrote out the full plan last night. I need 15 men and I need them within the week." "You'll have them." "I need to be the one running it," she said. "Not supervising from a distance, running it." He didn't hesitate. "Yes." She'd expected some form of resistance on that point. Some version of the inevitable conversation about whether it was appropriate, whether one of the ranch foremen should take charge, whether a woman directing 15 men on a fire line in the Sutter foothills was something the valley was ready for. She'd prepared 3 different arguments. He said yes, and her arguments sat unused, and she felt something in her chest do a complicated thing she was going to need to think about later when she had time. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. She picked up the measuring rod again and went back to work. And he stayed where he was, and the morning came on slowly around them, and the wind held it calm. And somewhere up in the Sutter Range a hillside full of dead grass waited with the patience of things that do not need to hurry because they know their moment is coming. She knew it too. She had always known it. The only question left was whether she'd get there first. The 15 men arrived on a Tuesday. Gideon had gathered them from across the valley. Ranch hands from 7 different properties, men who knew the land well enough to be useful, and who had been told only that there was work in the Sutter foothills that required an early start and physical endurance. He hadn't told them who was running it. Rowan understood why. There were conversations you had in person, with the work already visible in front of people, rather than conversations you had in advance and gave people time to argue about. She was at the trailhead before any of them, in the 4:30 dark, with the plan in her notebook, and the notebook in her breast pocket, and a weight in her chest that she'd been carrying since the previous evening when the wind had picked up to 17 miles an hour before dropping back down to 8 after midnight. 8 was workable. 8 was inside her window, but 17 had reminded her, with the particular efficiency of a fear that is rooted in real data rather than imagination, exactly what was at stake if she was wrong about the timing. She was not wrong about the timing. She told herself this while she checked the supply packs and verified the pre-wedding equipment and watched the sky in the east for the specific quality of pre-dawn light that told her what the morning air was doing. The sky was pale and still. Wind at 5. She breathed. The men came up the trail in groups of 2 and 3, leading their horses, talking among themselves in the low voices of people who've been awake earlier than they wanted to be. She recognized most of them. Pete Garvin from the Caldwell place, who had watched her free the horse at the barn dance and had not forgotten the look on his own face when she'd done it. 2 of the Hendersons' former hands, now working Gideon's consolidated operation. Tom Riley, who was the best horseman in the valley and knew it and was therefore sometimes difficult but always worth having. 4 men she didn't know by name, new to the territory, hired on when Gideon began the consolidation. They came out of the dark and found her standing at the trailhead with a lantern and a map spread on a flat rock, and the talking stopped in the way talking stops when people arrive somewhere and discover the situation is different from what they expected. Pete Garvin said it first. He said it with something between a question and a statement, which was the particular grammatical territory men occupy when they're surprised but trying not to show it. Miss Mercer. Garvin, she said, you're on the east perimeter, pre-wet crew. I'll explain the positions in a minute. She looked at the group without performing the look, just moved her eyes across the assembled faces, taking inventory the same way she took inventory of everything. Who was alert? Who was tired? Who was going to be a problem? Tom Riley, leaning against his horse with his arms folded, was looking at her with an expression that was not hostile, but was evaluating in a way that had a point to it. No offense, Miss Mercer, he said, but who put you in charge of this? I did, Gideon said from behind them. He'd come up the trail quietly. She'd heard his horse but hadn't turned, which she realized now had been its own kind of answer to anyone watching. He came to stand beside her at the map rock, which was not beside her in any formal or announced way, just where the map was. Miss Mercer has been tracking the fire risk in this valley for 2 years, Gideon said. She identified the risk. She designed this burn. She knows this terrain better than anyone in this group, including me. He looked at Tom Riley in the particular direct way he had that was not aggressive and somehow more effective because of it. If that's a problem, now's the time to say so and ride back down. Tom Riley looked at Gideon, looked at Rowan, unfolded his arms. No problem, he said. Good, Rowan said, and turned back to the map. Here's how this works. She talked for 12 minutes. She'd timed herself the night before because 12 minutes was the outer edge of how long you could hold a group of men who wanted to work rather than listen, and she'd gotten the plan into 11 minutes and 40 seconds without cutting anything essential. She explained the draw, the fuel load, the wind pattern. She explained the pre-wetting line on the eastern edge and why it mattered, that the east was where the burn could escape if the morning wind shifted, and if it escaped east, it would run toward the Caldwell North pasture in under an hour. She explained the 2 anchor points where she needed the most experienced men to hold the perimeter while the interior burned. She assigned positions by name, which she'd worked out the night before based on what she knew of each man's strengths, and which she'd adjusted in the last 3 minutes based on what she'd seen in their faces when they arrived. She put Tom Riley on the east anchor point. He was the best horseman and the most likely to give her trouble, and anchor point east was the most critical position and the hardest work. And she'd learned a long time ago that the best way to manage a man who needed to feel important was to give him something genuinely important to do. When she finished, Pete Garvin looked at the map for a moment and then said, with a quiet straightforwardness that surprised her, "You thought of everything." "I thought of most things," she said. "If something comes up that I didn't think of, tell me immediately. Don't manage it on your own." That landed. She saw it land. Not because it was a particularly extraordinary thing to say, but because it was an honest thing to say, and honest things had their own specific weight. "Questions?" she said. "No questions," which was either very good or meant she'd moved too fast. She looked at their faces and decided it was good. "First light in 20 minutes," she said. "Let's get into position." Balk. The burn started at 6:14 in the morning, which was 4 minutes later than she'd planned, because one of the pre-wetting hoses had a blockage that cost them time to clear. She cataloged the 4 minutes and decided they were acceptable and lit the first section herself. Fire is a particular thing when you've set it deliberately. There's a moment, brief, maybe 2 seconds, where it responds to you, where you can see it take the fuel and begin to organize itself. And in that 2 seconds, you understand both that you're in control, and that control is a more provisional thing than it looked on the map the night before. Rowan had set small controlled burns before, brush fires on cleared acreage, nothing at this scale. She had the theory completely right. The practice, she was discovering, had a texture that theory couldn't fully prepare you for. The fire moved down the draw the way she'd calculated, pulling toward the lower fuel load, following the grade, eating through the accumulated dead grass with a sound she'd read, described as a roar, but which was more precisely a sustained, consuming hiss at this stage, not yet large enough to be loud. The smoke rose in a column that leaned south-southwest at the top, which told her the upper air was doing what she'd expected, moving away from the valley floor. She was on her horse in the center of the operation, moving between positions every few minutes, watching the perimeter, reading the fire's movement against the plan she'd built. Gideon was on the eastern edge near Tom Riley's anchor point, which she'd asked him to be, not because she needed supervision there, but because she needed his authority present in the place most likely to require a fast decision without her. For the first 40 minutes, it worked. The burn moved at the rate she'd projected. The eastern pre-wet line held. The north anchor had one moment where the fire edged toward a stand of brush that was outside the planned burn area, and she was already moving toward it when Pete Garvin's crew beat her there and pushed the line back. She noted it without stopping. Good crew work, fast response, no escalation. 43 minutes in, the wind changed. Not dramatically, not the catastrophic shift she'd included in her contingency planning. It shifted 5 degrees, which doesn't sound like anything, except that 5 degrees in a draw with a specific fuel geometry meant the fire's left edge was now pushing toward the upper north section rather than running straight down the grade, and the upper north section was outside the burn perimeter and had not been pre-wetted. She saw it before anyone else said anything. She was already moving. Garvin, north edge upper section, right now. I need water on that line. She heard his acknowledgement and didn't look back. She pushed Compass up the ridge trail at a pace she wouldn't normally ask of a horse on uneven ground, but Compass had never once flinched from terrain and didn't now. She reached the upper north position, looked at the angle, looked at where the fire's edge was, and where it would be in 4 minutes at current movement. 3 of the new men were at this position. They looked at her with the focused attention of people who've been waiting for instruction without knowing they were waiting for it. "We're going to set a secondary line here," she said, pointing. 10 feet of cleared ground, scrape it down to dirt, now. You, and you. Move. They moved. She turned Compass and went back down to see where Garvin was and whether the water was reaching the upper line. And somewhere behind her she heard Tom Riley's voice from the east anchor, loud and controlled. "Holding east. East is holding," which meant the critical point was stable. She let that information settle into her calculations and adjusted the priority order. The next 22 minutes were the hardest 22 minutes she'd spent in her life since the winter. She was 17 and her father was ill, and she'd run the ranch entirely alone for 6 weeks in brutal cold with equipment that kept failing. They had a specific quality, those minutes. The quality of time when everything you know is being tested against everything you planned for, and you are finding out, in real time, with no opportunity for revision, whether you were right. She was mostly right. The secondary line held the north edge. The wind correction moved the burn back toward center. The east perimeter never broke, which she would think about later with a specific gratitude toward Tom Riley that she hadn't expected to feel. The fire consumed the draw in a pattern that was roughly, not perfectly, never perfectly, consistent with what she'd planned, and when the fuel was gone, the burn died back on its own, which is what fire does when you give it nothing left to eat. By 9:40 in the morning, they were looking at a blackened draw with a clean perimeter and a smoke column that was already beginning to flatten and thin in the improving air. The silence that followed was the particular silence of people who have been operating at maximum intensity and have not yet recalibrated to the fact that the intensity is over. Pete Garvin came up beside her. His face was wet with sweat and black at the edges from smoke, and he had a burn on his left forearm that he was going to need to have looked at. He looked at the draw for a long moment. "You knew," he said. "I knew the fuel load," she said. "The wind shift was a variable I planned for but hoped I wouldn't need. You moved fast when it shifted. I was watching for it." He looked at her with an expression she didn't entirely know how to receive, the expression of a man who has worked alongside a woman for an hour that has made him recalibrate something he'd held without examining for his entire working life. "I owe you an apology," he said. "From the barn dance, the way I spoke to you." She looked at the blackened hillside. "You didn't know what you didn't know." Still, she agreed. Accepted. It was Gideon who found her afterward, when the crew was checking the perimeter and she'd stepped away from the operation to stand at the edge of the ridge and look at the valley below. She needed a moment that wasn't about the next task. She'd been taking those occasionally since she was about 12. Small moments outside the work where she let herself just be somewhere. He came up beside her without announcing himself, which she'd gotten so used to that it no longer startled her. Below them, the valley spread out in the mid-morning sun, green and brown and silver where the creek caught the light, the ranch buildings scattered across it like objects someone had set down and forgotten to pick up. 11 ranches. The valley she'd been born into and had never left, and had spent 20 years quietly holding together with her notebook and her 4 in the mornings. "It worked," he said. "Most of it," she said. Rowan. He said it differently than he usually said it, not the easy, practical way he'd developed over weeks of working together, the way you say someone's name when you're about to ask about water tables or fence lines. He said it like a sentence that needed more words to complete it. She kept looking at the valley. Dorian's decision on the lease, he said. I want you to know it was never a real question. Not for me. I know, she said. You said. I want to say it again because I should have said it more clearly the first time. A pause. Your family's lease is secure. It's not contingent on anything. I'm not holding it over your head. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with that specific attention she'd never entirely gotten used to. The attention that saw her and didn't flinch from the seeing. I know what people are saying, she said, about why you spend time with me. That you want the land knowledge. That once you have it, do you believe that? She thought about the honest answer. She'd been thinking about the honest answer for weeks, actually, turning it over in the privacy of the barn and her notebook and the 4 in the morning dark. No, she said. I don't believe it, but I think it matters that other people do. Why does it matter? Because I have to live in this valley after you've made all your decisions, she said. And if this... She gestured between them imprecisely at the thing that had been building since a barn dance and a lantern and a horse that convinced itself it was trapped. If this doesn't turn into what it looks like, I'm still here. And this valley has a long memory. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man who doesn't have a response. The quiet of a man choosing between the responses he has. What if it does turn into what it looks like, he said. She looked at him. The smoke from the draw was thin now, almost gone, dissipating into the clear blue of the morning sky. Behind them she could hear the crew talking, the sound of horses, the practical activity of aftermath. That's a large question, she said. It's the question I've been working up to for about 6 weeks, he said. Despite herself, she felt something shift in her chest. Not the complicated, anxious shift she'd been managing since the beginning, but something simpler. Something that felt, carefully and provisionally, like the beginning of permission. Ask me again, she said. When we're not standing in front of a fire, you just trusted me to run. Why? Because I want to be sure it's me you're asking, she said. Not the woman who just saved your property. He looked at her for a long moment, then, Rowan, I watched you in that barn at the Caldwell dance before I knew your name or your family, or that you knew a single thing about this land. I stood there with a lantern and watched how you moved, and I thought I had not seen anyone be that fully, completely themselves in a very long time. He paused. That's who I'm asking. She turned away from him and looked at the valley. Her eyes were doing something she was not going to acknowledge. Ask me again anyway, she said, when the smoke clears. He accepted that with the same grace he'd accepted everything she'd given him that was harder to receive than he'd expected, and she was grateful for it. Dorian Ashcroft was in the ranch yard when they came back down. She'd half expected this. He'd have watched the smoke column from the valley and done the math and ridden out to see what had happened, which was what a man who ran operations on paperwork did when something occurred outside the paperwork. He was standing in the yard with his arms folded and the particular expression of a man who has been revising his understanding of a situation and hasn't finished the revision yet. He watched them ride in. He watched the crew come down behind them. He watched the state of people, the sweat, the smoke, the controlled fatigue of men who have done something hard and come out the other side of it. His eyes went to Pete Garvin's burned arm, to Tom Riley, who nodded at Rowan as he passed, to the blackened hem of Rowan's work dress, the gray dress that was her permanent uniform, which now also had a scorched line along the bottom edge where she'd gotten too close to the perimeter fire during the wind shift. The draw, Dorian said, addressing Gideon. Gone, Gideon said. Clean burn, perimeter held. Dorian looked at Rowan. You ran this. Yes, she said. And the wind shift at 43 minutes. She looked at him more carefully. You were watching. I was on the ridge above the east position, he said. I saw the edge move north. He paused. I saw you move faster. She waited. The secondary line, he said. That was your call? Yes. That was the right call. The yard was quiet. The crew was moving around them, leading horses to water, beginning the work of cleaning equipment, giving the conversation space without being asked to. Dorian unfolded his arms. It was a small gesture, but she'd learned to read small gestures, and this one meant something. "I've been doing this work for 9 years," he said, "and I have never, not once, had someone show me a documented 2-year risk prediction and then demonstrate its accuracy within a 5% margin during a live operation." He said it with the particular tone of a man who finds this uncomfortable to admit and is admitting it anyway because the evidence has left him no dignified alternative. "The Mercer lease file," he said, addressing Gideon but not quite taking his eyes off Rowan, "needs to move to a different category." "Which one?" Gideon said. Dorian looked at Rowan. "We don't have a category for what she is," he said. "We're going to need to make one." She hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected any version of that. She'd expected the continued version of the first day. The clean boots, the efficient appraisal, the folder. She didn't say anything. She was working out whether she trusted it. "The fire risk you identified," Dorian said, "extends to 4 other properties in this portfolio. The fuel load conditions you described at the 3rd site. I need you to walk me through the other properties with the same analysis you gave me on your map." He paused. "If you're willing." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm willing," she said. "When?" "Tomorrow, if you can manage it." "I can manage it," she said. She looked at Gideon, who was watching her with an expression she didn't try to decode right now. "I'll need the survey maps for the other properties." "I'll have them tonight," Gideon said. She nodded and led Compass toward the barn, and behind her she heard Dorian say to Gideon quietly, "You were right about her." And Gideon say simply, "I know." And neither of them said it loudly enough that she was obviously supposed to hear, but the yard was quiet and sound carried, and she heard it. She unsaddled Compass in the barn and stood for a moment with her forehead against the horse's neck, the way she'd stood after hard things her whole life: barn walls, horse smell, the simple animal warmth of a creature that did not require anything of her beyond what she was. "Good girl," she said to Compass. Compass stamped once and exhaled. Rowan patted her and went to get the water bucket. The valley found out by evening. These things moved in Blackstone Ridge with an efficiency that had nothing to do with communication infrastructure and everything to do with the fundamental human interest in what happens to other people. By the time the sun was going down, every ranch in the valley knew there'd been a burn in the Upper Sutter Range that morning, that it had been a controlled operation, that it had worked, and that Rowan Mercer had been the one running it. The reactions were various. Ed Caldwell, whose north pasture was the property most directly spared by the clearing of the draw, rode over himself that evening. He tied his horse at the gate and walked to the barn, where Rowan was doing the end-of-day chores, and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands. "I heard what you did," he said. She looked up from the water trough she was cleaning. "Word travels." "Miss Mercer." He stopped, started again. "My north pasture. If that draw had gone up in a dry wind." "I know," she said. "I didn't listen to you," he said, "when you came to me 2 years ago. I should have." She looked at him for a moment. He was a big man, Ed Caldwell, and he had the look of someone for whom saying this kind of thing cost real effort, and she respected the effort even if she felt complicated about the occasion for it. "You know now," she said. "I do." He turned his hat in his hands. "The valley owes you something." "The valley can start by not selling the grazing land on the East Ridge to that timber operation that came through in the spring," she said. "That land has the last native grass cover in this range, and if it goes, the erosion into the creek system." "All right," he said, almost smiling. "All right, you can tell me the rest inside. My wife wants to thank you herself, and she made a pie." She didn't particularly want pie or thanks, but she recognized a moment when refusing it would cost more than accepting it. "I'll finish here and come over," she said. He nodded and went, and she stood alone in the barn for a moment in the evening quiet. The scorched gray dress was going to need washing. The hem was probably beyond repair, which meant cutting it shorter or replacing it, and she knew without thinking about it that she'd cut it shorter because she was not a woman who replaced things that could still function. She looked at the dress for a moment. The worn gray fabric, the fraying hem that was now also scorched, the sleeve she'd mended twice, and thought about the morning Edith had told her she'd embarrass the family dressed like that when the landowner's man came to inspect. The landowner had come himself, and he had stood in this barn and asked her about water tables with the same quality of attention most men reserve for things they intended to own. She did not know exactly what came next. That was the honest truth of it. She did not know. And the not knowing had a different quality now than it had always had before. It had always been an anxious not knowing, the not knowing of a woman who understood that her situation could get worse and had limited control over the ways in which it might. This was something else. This felt like a not knowing that contained, provisionally and carefully, and without any guarantees, the possibility of something good. She was not yet ready to call it more than that. She went to wash up before walking over to the Caldwell place, and when she passed the kitchen window, she could hear Edith inside, on the other side of the glass, talking to someone in the careful, excited way Edith talked when she was recalibrating her position on something. She couldn't make out the words. She didn't try. The evening air was cool and still, the wind entirely gone, which made it the best air the valley had seen in 3 weeks. She crossed the yard in her worn gray dress with the scorched hem and walked toward the neighbor's gate, and above her the sky was doing what the sky always did at this hour, in this valley, turning colors that had no exact names, moving through amber and copper and a kind of deep bruised purple at the edges. And she looked at it the way she'd looked at it her entire life, from this same yard, in this same dress, and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the looking was not lonely. The pie was apple, which Rowan didn't particularly care for, but she ate 2 slices because Martha Caldwell had made it with the specific intention of saying something she didn't have words for, and Rowan understood that and received it accordingly. She sat at the Caldwell kitchen table for an hour and a half, which was longer than she'd intended, but the conversation kept moving in directions she hadn't expected. Ed Caldwell had questions, real questions, not the polite, deflecting kind he'd offered 2 years ago when she'd come to him about the fire risk. He wanted to understand the grass rotation she'd described to Gideon. He wanted to know about the East Ridge timber situation and what specifically she thought would happen to the creek drainage if the topsoil went. He listened the way people listen when they've recently been frightened into paying attention, which was not the most flattering reason to finally be heard, but was, she'd decided long ago, better than not being heard at all. Martha refilled her coffee twice without asking. That was its own kind of thing. She walked home in the dark under a sky that had gone full black and brilliant, the stars doing what they did in dry country when there was no moisture in the air to soften them. She was tired in the deep physical way that comes from a day of genuine, sustained effort, the kind of tired that is uncomfortable and satisfying at the same time. And she was thinking about tomorrow's survey meetings with Dorian, and about the North Spring gravity line calculations she needed to revisit, and she was not thinking about Gideon. Or she was trying not to think about Gideon, which was a different activity than not thinking about him and considerably less successful. She crossed the yard and stopped. He was sitting on the top rail of the paddock fence, in the dark, with the loose posture of a man who has been waiting long enough to get comfortable waiting. Compass was standing on the other side of the fence and appeared to have accepted the company, which said something, because Compass was selective. "You waited," Rowan said. "I said I'd ask again when the smoke cleared," he said. The smoke cleared. She stood where she was, 10 feet away, with the stars overhead and the quiet of the settled night around them, and the smell of horses and dry grass that was the permanent smell of everything she'd ever known. "I'm tired," she said. "I know. I won't keep you long." He didn't move from the fence rail. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to hear it without the fire and without the crew, and without your stepmother's voice coming through the window, which I'm aware you heard that night." She looked at him. "You knew I heard." "The yard isn't that big," he said, "and you went very still in a particular way." She hadn't known he'd been watching that closely. She filed that information carefully, the way she filed everything. "Ask then," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she appreciated that he didn't rush it, that he sat with it the same way he sat with hard information about water tables and dying springs, not flinching from the weight of it. "I would like to build something here," he said, "not just the land operation, something that lasts longer than a business plan. And I have spent the last 2 months understanding that there is no version of that, no version that is worth what I'd want it to be worth, that doesn't have you in the center of it." He paused. "Not because of what you know, because of who you are when nobody's asking anything of you and you're just standing in a barn in the dark writing numbers in a notebook that no one's ever asked to see." The night was very quiet. Compass stamped once in the paddock. "That's a large thing to say," Rowan said. "It's a large thing to mean," he said, "but I mean it. She looked at him on the fence rail. This man who had come to her valley with a folder full of leases and had ended up holding a lantern in the dark at a barn dance and had never, not once in 2 months, looked at her the way the world had always looked at her. As background, as utility, as the woman in the worn dress who kept things running while the real story happened somewhere else. She thought about what Edith had said. He'll find an appropriate match. She thought about Cora's voice, light and dismissive. Men like that don't end up with women like Rowan. She thought about the fact that she had been right about the water table, right about the grass, right about the fire. 2 years of being right about everything while nobody asked, and then one man showed up with a lantern and started asking, and here they were. "I'm not easy to be around," she said. "I notice everything that's wrong and I say so. I work before dawn and I don't always remember to come in for meals, and I have opinions about grazing rotation that I will share whether you want them or not." "I know," he said. "I've spent 2 months being notified of everything that's wrong with 800 acres of land." And I've never felt better informed," he said. Despite herself, despite everything, she felt the corner of her mouth move. "My father is going to need help," she said. "He's not going to change, but he's going to need managing, which will mostly fall to me because it always has." "I understand." Edith will adjust," he said simply. "Or she won't. And either way, you've been managing that situation since you were 17 without any help from me, and with help you'll manage it easier." She looked at the ground for a moment, at her boots, which needed resoling and which she'd been putting off because there was always something more urgent. At the scorched hem of the gray dress that she'd cut 2 inches shorter that afternoon with the kitchen scissors, while Edith watched from the doorway with an expression that couldn't decide whether to be appalled or afraid. "You told me in the bar that you came here to do things differently," she said. "I did." "This valley is going to test that," she said. "The water situation isn't resolved. The grass recovery is a 3-year project at minimum. We lost the native cover on 2 south sections that may not come back in my lifetime. And there's a drainage issue on the Henderson property that's going to cause a problem for 3 downstream operations within 2 seasons if it isn't addressed, and I cannot get Dorian to understand why it's urgent." "I'll talk to Dorian," he said. "I'll handle Dorian," she said. "He's starting to listen." She looked up at him. "I just need you to know that this—" She gestured at the valley and the dark around them, at the whole struggling, beautiful, complicated mess of it. "This isn't a finished thing. It's going to be work. Real work. The kind that doesn't resolve." "I know what real work is," he said quietly. She believed him. That was the thing. She looked at him there in the dark, and she simply believed him. And it wasn't the reckless belief of a woman who'd been lonely and had let loneliness do her deciding. It was the considered belief of a woman who had spent 2 months watching a man make good on what he said, and who had learned, through the long, specific education of her own life, to tell the difference. "All right," she said. He went very still. "All right?" "All right," she said again. "Yes, to whatever it is you were actually asking." He got down from the fence rail, came to stand in front of her, closer than the practical working distance they'd maintained for 2 months, and she held her ground and looked at him directly because she had never in her life looked away from a thing that mattered. "I was asking you to marry me," he said, "specifically." "I know what you were asking," she said. He reached out and took her hand, the calloused one, the one with the wire scar on the thumb, and held it the way you hold something you intend to keep, without squeezing, without performing, just holding. "I've been carrying this valley alone for a long time," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. "I know," he said. "I'm not good at letting people help." "I've noticed that too," he said. "We'll work on it." She stood in the dark with her hand in his, and the stars overhead, and Compass watching from the paddock, with the mild curiosity of a horse who has seen many things and registered most of them as less interesting than hay. And she felt something release in her chest that she hadn't even known was held. Some long-maintained tension, some permanent bracing against the next thing that would require her to absorb it alone, that had been there so long she'd stopped recognizing it as a choice and started experiencing it as her natural state. "You'll have to speak to my father," she said. "Tomorrow," he said. "He'll say yes immediately, and then forget the conversation happened. Then I'll speak to him twice." She almost laughed. Not the short, sharp version she used when something hurt, the real one, from lower down, that she'd always rationed carefully because it felt too much like an announcement. "Come in for coffee," she said. "It's late, but I'm not going to sleep for a while anyway." "Neither am I," he said. They went inside. Harlan Mercer said yes on the first conversation, and had indeed forgotten it by the following morning, which required a second conversation as predicted. The second time, Rowan was present, which anchored the information more successfully. Her father looked at her across the kitchen table with an expression she hadn't seen on him in a long time. Something complicated, something that was trying to be pride and was hampered by the knowledge that he hadn't earned the right to it cleanly. "You did all right," he said, which from Harlan Mercer was the equivalent of a speech. "I know," she said, without cruelty. Edith's reaction was more layered. There was one day, the day after the conversation with Harlan, where Edith was visibly working through a series of internal positions and landing hard on each one before moving to the next. By the second day, she had arrived at a version of gracious acceptance that was not entirely genuine but was not entirely performance either, somewhere in the complicated middle territory where people end up when reality has diverged too far from expectation for them to maintain the original position. She came to Rowan's room that second evening and stood in the doorway, which she almost never did. "I wasn't always fair to you," she said. Rowan was mending a shirt and didn't stop mending it. "No, I didn't." Edith paused, doing the painful thing of choosing honesty over justification, which did not come naturally to her. "I didn't see you. I saw what you weren't." "I know what you saw," Rowan said. "I'm sorry for it." Rowan looked up from the shirt. Edith was standing in the doorway with her arms folded across her middle, the way people do when they feel exposed, and she looked older than she usually managed to look, and more real. "I know you are," Rowan said. She went back to the mending. "We'll get along better now. We always do better when things are settled." It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was something more practical. An acknowledgement that they had to share a life and had always shared a life, and that the terms of it were shifting, and that shifting terms required adjustment from everyone involved. Rowan had never expected Edith to love her. She'd have settled, her whole life, for being seen. And seen was what she was now, whether Edith had chosen it or not. Cora took it the hardest, which surprised Rowan, and then didn't. Cora had understood herself, her whole life, to be the one things happened toward. The beauty, the wit, the social ease that made rooms rearrange themselves around her. The idea that the room had rearranged around Rowan, specifically and definitively, was a restructuring of the world that Cora did not have tools for. She was cold for 2 weeks. Then one afternoon she came to the barn while Rowan was working and sat down on the bench without being invited and said, "How did you know he was serious?" Rowan thought about the honest answer. "I watched what he did when nobody was watching him do it." Cora was quiet. "He wasn't performing," Rowan said. "He was just there. Consistently there." She glanced at her half-sister. "That's the thing you look for. Not what they say when they're trying to impress you. What they do when they've forgotten to try." Cora looked at her for a long moment with an expression Rowan hadn't seen on her before. A younger expression, less polished, something that was actually asking rather than managing. "I don't know how to look for that," Cora said. "I know," Rowan said, not unkindly. "You've been looked at your whole life. It's a different skill than looking." Cora left without responding, but she was less cold after that. Not warm, not yet, but less cold. And in the Mercer household, that was meaningful progress. They were married in the fall, when the grass on the south sections was showing the first tentative signs of recovery and the water table had stabilized. Not recovered, but stabilized, which was the first piece of genuinely good news the North Pasture measurement had given her in 3 years. The ceremony was small, because Rowan wanted it small, and Gideon had understood immediately that wanting it small was not modesty or self-deprecation, but a genuine preference from a woman who had no interest in being looked at for performance, and every interest in the thing being real. Ed Caldwell and his wife came. Pete Garvin came and stood in the back and didn't say much, and was one of the first to shake Gideon's hand afterward. And when he shook Rowan's hand too, he did it the way you shake the hand of someone you respect, firmly and without fuss. Dorian Ashcroft came, which surprised her. He came alone, without paperwork, which was the version of Dorian she'd come to understand was his actual self underneath the organized folders. A man who was genuinely intelligent and genuinely committed to doing things correctly, who had simply never had the right information and had not known he was missing it. She'd spent the better part of 3 weeks walking him through the valley's systems with the same thoroughness she'd used with Gideon, and he'd responded with the particular focus of a man who recalibrates well once he accepts that recalibration is necessary. After the ceremony, standing in the Caldwell yard in the thin fall sunlight, he came to where she was standing and said, without preamble, "The board approved the water infrastructure project." She looked at him. "The gravity line system." "And the creek rehabilitation on the Henderson drainage," he said. "Full budget. Spring start." He paused. "Your projections were in the proposal. The board wanted to know who'd done the analysis." "What did you tell them?" "The truth," he said. "That our best asset in this valley was someone we'd nearly terminated a lease on." He said it with the particular dry tone of a man who has made peace with being wrong about something significant and has chosen to carry it as a lesson rather than an embarrassment. "I told them her name." She held his gaze. "Thank you, Dorian." "Thank yourself," he said. "I just read what you wrote." He went to find a glass of something, and she stood in the fall light and thought about the 2 years of notebooks, the water measurements nobody asked for, the fire risk assessments she'd written in the small hours while the household slept, the plans she'd built in her head because building them on paper felt too much like proof that nobody was listening. Somebody was listening now. The gravity line went in the following spring. She supervised the installation herself, which was not strictly necessary and which everyone understood was going to happen regardless. The 2 upper springs she'd identified fed into a collection tank on the north ridge, and from there down to the main operation by grade alone, no pump required, which had been the elegant part of the plan and the part she'd been most satisfied with when she'd first worked it out on the back of an old feed invoice at age 22. Watching the first water run clean through the new line into the north tank, she stood with her arms crossed and felt something she had no efficient word for. Not pride exactly, because pride implies the thing was for you, and this wasn't for her. This was for the land. This was the land getting something it had needed for a long time, finally getting it because someone had done the slow, patient work of understanding it well enough to know what to provide. Gideon came and stood beside her. "You're not going to say anything, are you?" he said. "You're just going to look at it." "I've been looking at this spot in my head for 4 years, she said. "Let me have a minute." He let her have it. That was something she'd learned about him in the months since the wedding, and was still learning. The ways his patience was real rather than practiced. He didn't wait with difficulty. He didn't wait with the particular restlessness of a person who wants to be patient and isn't quite. He simply was patient, the way she simply knew the land, as a baseline quality rather than an effort. They were not a perfect pair. She knew that and had stopped wanting them to be, which was its own kind of progress. She was still too quiet in the mornings before the work settled her into herself, still too blunt in situations that called for more social navigation than she typically had patience for. She still worked before 4 and forgot dinner and had opinions about grazing rotation that she shared whether solicited or not. He had his own corners, a tendency to move faster on decisions than she was comfortable with, a difficulty admitting when he was tired that sometimes curdled into a shorter temper than his usual, a relationship with his extended family that brought complications she hadn't fully mapped yet. They were real people living a real life, which meant it was hard sometimes and good, most of the time, and occasionally, in the early morning when the light was right and the work was going well and they sat together at the kitchen table with their coffee and their notebooks and their separate thoughts, it was something she didn't have a name for, that was better than any name she could have given it. Well, 2 years after the controlled burn, she took her first student. It wasn't a planned thing. A girl from the Henderson operation, 15 years old, named Clara, had been following Rowan at a polite distance for several weeks whenever their paths crossed. And Rowan had noticed and hadn't said anything about it because she recognized the specific behavior of a person who wants to ask for something and doesn't know how to ask. Eventually, she stopped on the road one morning and waited for Clara to catch up. "You want to learn something," Rowan said. The girl was startled into honesty. "Yes, ma'am." "What?" "All of it," Clara said, and then looked embarrassed by the scope of her own answer. Rowan looked at her for a moment. The mud on her boots, the direct quality of her attention, the notebook she was carrying under her arm that she probably didn't know Rowan had noticed. "Start Monday," Rowan said. 4 in the morning. Bring the notebook." Clara came at 3:50, which was either enthusiasm or anxiety, and either way was the right instinct. Rowan showed her the water measurements first, because the water was the foundation of everything, and Clara asked good questions and wrote them down, and by the end of the week she was asking questions Rowan hadn't answered yet because they were questions Rowan was still working on herself. There was more than one version of being seen, she was learning. Being seen by someone who valued you was one kind. Seeing someone else's capability clearly enough to reflect it back to them was another kind, and it carried its own particular weight. By the following spring, Clara was doing the North Pasture measurements on her own and reporting her findings to Rowan with the specific precision of a person who has learned that precision is respect for the thing being measured. And Rowan would read her numbers and occasionally correct, and occasionally confirm, and occasionally say nothing because Clara had gotten it exactly right, and the silence was its own form of acknowledgement. There were others over the years. Not many. Rowan had no interest in teaching people who weren't ready to be taught, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that she had limits as a teacher, that she lacked the softness some people needed in order to learn and could only offer the alternative, which was the particular encouragement of being taken seriously. But some people needed exactly that, and for those people she was right. The gray dress hung by the barn door. She hadn't planned that either. The hem had been repaired and scorched and cut shorter and repaired again, and by the fourth year it was genuinely at the end of its useful life. And she'd bought a new work dress, 2 of them, practical dark wool that held up better in wet weather. She'd been about to pack the old one away, and one of the young hands had seen her with it and asked what it was, and she'd tried to explain and had realized partway through the explanation that what she was actually explaining was the whole story. The barn dance, the lantern, the horse that convinced itself it was trapped, the man who asked about water tables, the fire and the draw, the moment she'd stood in a yard in that dress and understood that the world had finally turned to look at her. She hung it on the peg by the barn door instead. It was not a monument. It was not a declaration. It was just an old dress on a peg, the kind of thing that accumulates in barns because someone keeps forgetting to deal with it. But the hands who worked the Mercer Ashcroft operation knew the story, because stories in small valleys have a way of becoming part of the air eventually, and sometimes a new hand would ask about the dress, and whoever they asked would tell it the way people tell things that have become local legend. Not with invented details, but with the particular affectionate accuracy of people who know the subject of the story is still present and will correct errors. The dress stayed. Rowan passed it every morning going into the barn and every evening coming out, and she did not think about it consciously, the way you stop consciously seeing things that have been in their correct place long enough. But sometimes in the winter, when the light came through the barn door at a low angle and caught the gray fabric, she'd stop for half a second without meaning to, and the half second contained the whole of it, the woman she'd been, and the woman she'd become, and the knowledge that they were the same woman, that nothing about her had fundamentally changed, except that the world had finally arranged itself into a shape where what she was could be seen. She had not needed the world to change her. She had needed the world to look. There was something in that she turned over regularly, not as comfort exactly, but as information, that the years of being ignored had not made her smaller. She'd been afraid they had sometimes, in the quiet of the barn with her notebook, afraid that invisibility was doing its slow, erosive work on her in ways she couldn't measure. But they hadn't. They'd made her thorough. They'd made her patient. They'd made her the kind of woman who documented the water table for 2 years with no expectation of being believed, because the water table was real, whether anyone believed it or not. The truth was a thing that kept whether or not you had witnesses. She'd built her whole life on that. It turned out it was also a foundation for everything else. One morning in the 5th year, she was at the north tank when Gideon came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one without a word and stood beside her looking at the water level, which was the highest it had been since she'd started measuring. The gravity line system had done what she'd calculated it would do. The south sections had recovered. The creek that had been surface running on borrowed time now had underground feed again, slow but real, the aquifer responding to 3 years of managed grazing and reduced extraction, the way land responds when you give it the conditions it needs. She looked at the water level in the tank. She looked at the number she'd written in her notebook that morning. She looked at the number she'd written the morning 4 years ago when it had been 9 inches lower and her father had said she worried too much. She drank her coffee. "The Henderson North pasture needs its rotation adjusted," she said. "I know," Gideon said. "Clara flagged it yesterday." "She's right." She usually is, he said. She learned from someone. Rowan looked at the water, felt the morning on her face, the early cold that she'd always loved best because it was honest, what the day actually was before the sun softened it. I was thinking, she said. You're always thinking. I was thinking about extending the spring survey to the Upper East Ridge. There's a seam up there I noticed 2 falls ago that I haven't had time to investigate properly, and I think it might be feeding into the creek system in ways we're not accounting for. He was quiet for a moment. How long to survey it? 2 days, maybe 3. She looked at him. Come with me. He looked back at her, the same eyes that had held a lantern in a barn 4 years ago, and watched her work with the kind of attention she'd almost stopped expecting from the world. 4:30, he said. 4, she said. 4, he agreed. She turned back to the tank, wrote the water level in her notebook, closed it, put it in her breast pocket, where it had always lived, worn soft as skin. The valley spread out behind them in the early morning, good and struggling and alive the way real things are. Not resolved, not finished, not arriving anywhere permanent, just continuing, season by season, with the accumulated weight of everyone who had understood it well enough to care for it, and the promise, imperfect and real, of everyone who would come after. She finished her coffee and